Picture this: a census taker riding down a dirt road in 1870, clipboard in hand, deciding the racial destiny of every person he sees. He knocks on a cabin door, glances once at the family inside, and without asking a single question, he writes one word that will determine how that family's descendants will be treated for the next 150 years. Negro. Not because the people said it, not because they chose it, but because he did. Because in America, race wasn't self-identified, it was assigned. And those assignments weren't innocent mistakes. They were political, they were economic, they were strategic, and they were rooted in a deep fear of acknowledging something this country has tried to bury since its beginning. The truth about who is Native, who is Black, and how many of those people were the same. The uncomfortable truth is that race categories in the United States were never fixed, never scientific, and never neutral. They shifted every decade, rewritten by white officials who understood that racial classification was power. In 1790, the first census included only free white, all other free persons, and slaves. If you were Native but didn't live on a reservation, you were often lumped in as other, slave, or simply disappeared. Mixed-race people weren't allowed to exist on paper. The census taker didn't ask how you identified. He eyeballed you, judged your hair, your skin tone, your neighbors, and stamped you into a category that fit the racial imagination of white America. By 1850 and 1860, the category mulatto appears, but again, the person labeled never chose it. The census agent was told to use his own eyes to decide whether someone looked distinctly mixed. And this is when the government accidentally revealed something it would later try to hide: the explosive rise in the mulatto population, which reflected how many white men were fathering children with enslaved Black women. The truth of plantation rape was becoming too visible, literally showing up in the numbers. And white lawmakers didn't want the census exposing the reality that thousands of enslaved people carried white blood. Then comes the 1890 census, the most racist counting in American history. Obsessed with categorizing blood fractions, it invented quadroon and octoroon, desperately trying to measure how close someone was to whiteness. This was not anthropology, it was a tool of domination. It was the US government quantifying proximity to white purity. But even this wasn't enough for the white officials who feared that acknowledging mixed ancestry gave Black people too much connection to whiteness, too much legitimacy, too much humanity. And then enters one of the most important villains in racial classification history, Edward Dana Duran, director of the Census Bureau from 1909 to 1912. Duran personally erased the mulatto category. He believed that anyone with mixed African and European ancestry was Negro by nature, and that keeping mulatto on the books granted them a level of identity too close to white. So he removed it. With the stroke of a pen, the entire mixed-race population of America was collapsed into one word: Negro. This one action cemented the federal one-drop rule and eliminated millions of people's accurate heritage. It's the same logic that later shaped national conversations about identity. In a 2010 interview on The View with Barbara Walters, Walters asked President Barack Obama why he didn't identify as biracial. Obama responded plainly, "I'm African American, and I accept that because the community I belong to knows that we are all mixed race." And it's ironic, almost infuriating, because this country spent more than a century forcing biracial and mixed-race people into the Negro category, erasing their identities, only for white Americans to now have the nerve to ask why someone like Obama doesn't publicly embrace the biracial label the government itself outlawed. His answer wasn't just personal. It was a mirror held up to the lies America told about race for generations. This erasure is also connected to the descendants of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. DNA later proved what Black families had always known. The Hemings descendants were Jefferson's biological heirs. But for generations, white society denied them and fought against acknowledging them, because acknowledging mixed ancestry threatened the myth of racial purity. The census system was designed to protect that myth, not to reflect the truth. By 1930, the census instructions openly declared that anyone with any Negro blood must be classified as Negro. That one line codified the one-drop rule into federal policy, erasing countless Black Indigenous people and mixed individuals from the Native category forever. It also declared that only full-blood Native Americans, or those living on reservations, could be recorded as Indian. Anyone mixed with African ancestry was automatically Black. Anyone mixed with Native and African ancestry was Black. Anyone looking too dark was Black. Entire communities of Afro-Indigenous people disappeared from tribal counts because a white man with a pencil decided they didn't fit the image of what he believed an Indian should look like. And now, in the middle of that long historical erasure, another controversy is rising: the meaning of African American itself. What once was a unifying term during the Jesse Jackson years has become a battlefield in modern politics. Today, new immigrants from Africa, the Caribbean, India, and South Asia slip under the African American label when it grants them proximity to Black struggles, political legitimacy, or social capital, and then abandon it when distancing benefits them. You see an Indian mayor in New York boldly declaring immigrants built New York, casually rewriting centuries of unpaid Black labor that laid the city's foundation. You see Austin Chenge, the Nigerian-born Republican who ran for office while proposing the cancellation of Juneteenth, lecturing the very people whose ancestors lived, died, and built this country under bondage. These newcomers have no multi-generational lineage here, yet feel entitled to shape the meaning of African American identity. And this is exactly why FBA activists, lineage-based scholars, and genealogists are pushing back. Because the African American label has become a political costume for newcomers, a shortcut to credibility that bypasses the blood-deep sacrifices of those who've been here for 400 years. The era of broad, interchangeable identity categories is fading. In its place is a demand for precision, a demand for lineage, a demand not to be erased. And this is exactly why, in modern times, a growing movement of FBA, foundational Black American genealogists and historians, has begun unearthing erased Afro-Indigenous ancestry. Through Dawes Rolls documents, Freedmen treaties, family archives, and historical land records, they are exposing how the government's racial engineering separated people who shared bloodlines, cultures, and histories. Their work is beginning to restore what census takers tried to destroy: the undeniable truth that many Native and FBA families were one people long before Washington decided otherwise. And that erasure wasn't just symbolic, it was economic. The Dawes Rolls, the federal documents created between 1898 and 1907 to allot tribal land in what is now Oklahoma, were never neutral lists. They were gateways to land, resources, and future tribal benefits. White men understood this. That's why you had the infamous $5 Indians, white people who paid bribes to enroll as Indian by blood so they could seize land that did not belong to them. Meanwhile, Black-presenting Native people were shoved into the freedmen category or excluded entirely, even when they had Native parents or grandparents. The federal government froze those racist classifications into law, and many tribes later adopted them into their own citizenship rules. The consequences echo into modern cases where tribal nations have spent years fighting in court to exclude the descendants of their own freedmen. People whose ancestors were enslaved by the tribes, lived among the tribes, and signed treaties promising them citizenship forever. Those treaties were ignored. And then white Americans pretend to be confused when they ask, how did the Black population jump to 40 million today when only about 388,000 Africans were brought directly to the United States? But the census was not merely counting enslaved Africans. It was sweeping Afro-Indigenous, mixed-race, Caribbean, Creole, and Native Black people into the same bucket under the force of law. When you collapse every non-white group with any African ancestry into one category for over a century, of course the numbers grow. Not because millions of Africans secretly arrived, but because millions of people were reclassified into that category, whether they wanted it or not. This is why families across Black America speak of the Cherokee grandmother, the Choctaw great-grandfather, the Chickasaw ancestor who lived in a shack out back, the grandmother who spoke a native language but was counted as Negro on every census. Some of these stories are memory. Some are loss. Some are mixed ancestry erased by federal policy. And some are the remnants of those Afro-Indigenous lineages that census takers made invisible. The truth is, those stories don't sound mythological when you understand how the census worked. They sound like survival. It is also why anti-Blackness within certain Native communities today is not a mystery. If the federal government spent 150 years telling tribes that darker-skinned people weren't Indian, if white officials elevated light-skinned natives and white pretenders into tribal citizenship while forcing Native Black families into the Negro category, then you've created a system where anti-Blackness becomes a structural inheritance. You can see this in modern conflicts. Freedmen descendants in the Cherokee Nation fighting for rights guaranteed in an 1866 treaty. Freedmen descendants in the Muskogee Creek Nation only recently winning court victories after decades of exclusion. Tribal constitutions rewritten to favor by-blood status, a category that itself was defined by white federal agents, not by tribal tradition. And while all this was happening, while Black and Afro-Indigenous people were pushed out, white Americans were climbing onto Native identity, sometimes through fantasy, sometimes through fraud, sometimes through bribes and paperwork, but always through the belief that Native identity was something they could claim while simultaneously participating in the erasure of darker Native people. Even today, you see white individuals claiming Cherokee ancestry as a form of social accessorizing, while actively dismissing the Native identity of Black families who actually appear on the Dawes rolls. The modern census finally allows self-identification, finally allows people to check multiple boxes, finally acknowledges the complexity of American ancestry. But the damage is already done. Generations disappeared on paper. Mixed ancestries collapsed into single racial categories. Native communities stripped of their Afro-Indigenous histories. Black families severed from tribal nations that belonged to them by blood, by lineage, and by treaty. So when you hear someone ask why there are over 40 million African Americans today, from an initial population of fewer than 500,000 enslaved Africans, the answer is not mysterious. It is documented, it is historical, and it is deeply political. The category Negro was engineered to absorb Black, mixed, and Indigenous identities into a single label for the convenience of white supremacy. The category Indian was engineered to shrink, to control land, and to erase anyone who didn't look like a Hollywood stereotype. The numbers don't hide the truth. The numbers are the truth. The census tells the story of a nation that erased Black Indigenous people on purpose, erased mulatto identity on purpose, erased Native identity from Black families on purpose, expanded the Negro category on purpose, and then pretended these shifts were organic demographic changes instead of deliberate acts of racial engineering. And the country still hasn't reckoned with what those numbers reveal. Scope News tells the truth. Here are the facts. Sources include U.S. Census Archives, Dawes Rolls records, Freedmen treaties, genealogical research from FBA historians, racial classification laws, and public transcripts from Barack Obama's 2010 appearance on The View. Legal disclaimer. This content is for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes. It discusses sensitive historical topics, and viewer discretion is advised. While based on documented research and public records, some details rely on the best available archives. This is not legal advice or genealogical certification. Viewer discretion is advised.